The moment I turned onto my street, I felt something in my chest shift. Not quite panic, not quite dread, but something that told me the air had changed. That sixth sense, the one that bubbles up when something's wrong before your brain can name it, gripped me tight the second I saw the bold red letters stamped across the wooden post planted on my front lawn. The word "sold" screamed at me from the white and red sign like a slap to the face. I sat in my car for a moment, hands frozen on the steering wheel, the engine still running, while the weight of the moment tried to catch up with my breath. For a brief second, I convinced myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe the sign company got the wrong address. Maybe one of my neighbors had sold their home and someone placed the sign in front of mine by accident. Maybe I was being paranoid or melodramatic after a long, draining shift at the hospital. But the longer I stared, the less sense that made. The sign was dead center on my lawn, staked right between the two hydrangea bushes I'd planted with my mother 5 years ago, the last spring before she passed away. No neighbor would ever be that careless. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. Something deliberate. Something personal. I got out of the car slowly, like the air had thickened around me, pushing back with every step. My heels crunched softly against the stone path leading to the front door, but the usual comfort I felt approaching my house, the warmth, the stability, the sense of home, was absent. Gone, like a chair yanked from under you mid-sit. My house, a modest but beautifully restored Victorian with wraparound porches and a library I'd converted from my mother's old music room, was the one place that had never changed, never betrayed me. Until now. I was still trying to process the sign when I walked inside and found him standing in the foyer, whistling some jaunty Sinatra tune as if he hadn't just detonated the last bit of peace I had left. My stepfather, Alan, wore a pale blue linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his loafers polished to an obnoxious shine. His suitcase was open on the bench by the staircase, already half full of wrinkle-resistant shirts and slim travel pants, clothing designed for a man preparing to gallivant across Europe, not one explaining why he'd sold a house that didn't belong to him. "You're home early," he said, not even glancing up from folding his passport wallet and slipping it into his carry-on like this was just any other day. I wanted to scream, to throw the keys in my hand across the hardwood floor and demand to know what the hell he'd done, but instead, my voice came out flat, clipped by disbelief. "Why is there a sold sign on the front lawn?" He paused, finally giving me the full effect of his smug, well-moisturized grin. That? Yes, the deal closed today. All the paperwork's handled. You won't have to worry about a thing. It took everything in me not to laugh in his face, if only to stop myself from crying. I won't have to worry about a thing? My name is on that deed. My name is on the tax records. My name is on the loan documents. He waved a hand in the air, brushing aside my words like I was being overdramatic or uninformed. It was never really yours, sweetheart. Not truly. Your mother bought it, and after she passed, it became part of the estate. And as the surviving spouse, I had the legal authority to handle it. I took a step closer, my hands trembling despite my best effort to appear calm. That's not how probate works, Alan. The house was willed to me. Not to us. Me. He rolled his eyes then, like I was some silly girl misunderstanding adult matters. You don't need a luxury home at your age, Lily, he said, walking back toward his suitcase. You're what now, 43? 44? A nurse, right? You work long hours, barely have time to keep the place up. It's too much house for someone like you. Someone like me. He said it so casually, as if he was doing me a favor. As if by selling my home out from under me, he was saving me from myself. Alan had always had that infuriating, belittling tone, the same one he used at dinner parties when introducing me as my late wife's daughter, still figuring out what she wants to be when she grows up. I'd tolerated it for years out of respect for my mother. But she was gone now, and his thin veil of charm had finally shredded. I crossed my arms, planting myself in the center of the foyer like a statue carved in fury. You had no right to do this. You know damn well Mom left this house to me in her will. He didn't deny it. He just shrugged. The buyer doesn't know that. The documents were clean enough. You'll get some money out of it, I made sure of that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish packing. My flight leaves in 4 hours. VIP tour of Rome, Paris, Barcelona. First class all the way. Then, with a wink that made my stomach churn, he added, "Don't wait up." I stood there as he zipped his suitcase and walked upstairs to grab whatever else he thought he needed for his luxurious escape. Every bone in my body told me to stop him, to scream, to call the police, to lawyer up immediately. But instead, I let him go. I let him roll that suitcase down the porch steps and into the back seat of the car waiting for him. I let him board that flight, order champagne, and recline in his first-class seat like he'd won something. Because I had a plan. And when he returned from his European dream vacation, sun-kissed and full of himself, he was going to learn the hard way that while he'd spent weeks packing for his little tour, I'd been preparing for something far more permanent. I wasn't just going to get my house back. I was going to make sure he had nowhere else to go. Alan always thought I was the naive one, the one who followed the rules, paid her bills on time, and never pushed back hard enough to matter. He built that entire illusion in his mind because it was easier for him to believe I was weak than to admit that I was watching closely, quietly, and with far more clarity than he ever realized. While he was taking long lunches with oily realtors and whispering into burner phones like a bad movie villain, I was collecting every piece of documentation he forgot to shred, every email he didn't realize had auto-forwarded to the estate lawyer, and every voicemail he left on our broker's line confirming his fraudulent claims of joint ownership. I may not be a lawyer myself, but I've spent enough time around grief, loss, and estates in my work at the hospital to know that when someone passes, things get messy. My mother had a small but airtight will. It wasn't fancy or complicated, but it was crystal clear. She left the house entirely to me. No shared ownership, no life estate for her husband, no trust, just a simple transfer of full title to me. And Alan had signed off on that without even reading the pages carefully, because at the time, he was so drunk with grief, or more likely, with self-pity, that he didn't think it mattered. For the past 6 weeks, while Alan had been planning his little escape to Europe, I'd been quietly revisiting the paperwork with my attorney, Meg. She's sharp and terrifying in all the best ways, the kind of woman who can smile sweetly while dismantling a man's entire financial existence with 3 sentences and a glare. She took one look at the forged amendment Alan had slipped into the estate transfer documents, poorly photoshopped, mind you, and said, with a voice like polished steel, "This is going to be fun." The thing Alan didn't understand about me is that while I might not be the loudest person in the room, I am always paying attention. I don't need to yell when I can document. I don't need to slam doors when I can open files. He assumed I wouldn't have backup copies of the original will. He assumed I'd never noticed the title company wasn't one my mother or I had ever worked with before. He assumed I wouldn't follow the trail of escrow deposits and bank wire transfers that led directly to a shell company he created 2 months ago. But I noticed everything. The moment he boarded that plane, I filed the injunction. It was waiting at the courthouse by the time his flight took off. The sale of the house, while not completely finalized in terms of ownership transfer, was technically in escrow. That escrow account was frozen by Monday morning. The buyer, a wealthy couple looking to flip homes in our historic neighborhood, was furious. They'd been sold a property with contested ownership. Alan had guaranteed them a clean title, and now they were stuck with a lawsuit and a pending fraud investigation. I called them personally to apologize, not for his actions, but for the inconvenience they were about to face, and let them know I'd be pursuing a reversal of the sale. Surprisingly, they weren't hostile with me. In fact, the woman, Maria, thanked me for the transparency and assured me their legal team would be taking action against Alan directly. "He seemed slick," she said on the phone. "But you seemed like the only honest one when we toured the place." I hadn't been home since that day. I stayed at Meg's guest house, she insisted, and spent my evenings going through old bank records, scanning every check Alan had ever written from the joint account he'd once shared with my mother. I found receipts, travel itineraries, Luxury purchases made months before her death, all while he cried about medical debt and drained savings. I used to believe he loved her. But now I wasn't sure if he had ever loved anyone but himself. The day before Alan's return, I went back to the house. It was technically still mine, though the lock had been changed during the fake closing. I had it rekeyed. I walked through the room slowly, taking inventory of everything he'd moved, packed, or tried to pawn off before leaving. There was a stack of auction brochures on the coffee table, each one marked with notes about what the piano could fetch and estate jewelry appraisal services. My mother's piano. Her rings. Her memory, whittled down to price tags in his mind. I sat in her old reading chair, the one by the bay window overlooking the garden, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to feel the grief again, not just for her, but for the home we'd built together. For the betrayal I hadn't seen coming. For the fact that the man she'd married in her later years, the one she thought would care for me if anything happened, turned out to be nothing more than a thief in an expensive watch. When his flight landed 2 days later, I already had the cameras rolling. He stepped out of the cab looking sunburned and bloated, wheeling his high-end luggage across the driveway with the swagger of someone who still believed he had the upper hand. He didn't even glance at the front door before digging in his pocket for the key. When it didn't work, he jiggled the knob. Then again. Then harder. I stepped onto the porch, file folder in hand, and cleared my throat. He turned, surprised but not alarmed. "Not yet." "Hey," he said. "Why'd you change the locks?" I handed him the envelope. "Court order. The sale's frozen. The buyers have withdrawn. Escrow has been voided. And you're under investigation for fraud." His face drained of color like water circling a drain. "You're joking." I almost smiled. "You don't need a luxury home at your age, Alan. Isn't that what you said?" He opened his mouth to argue, to spit, to manipulate, but I had already turned back inside, leaving him standing on the porch, suitcase in hand, with nowhere else to go. The following morning arrived with the kind of stillness that often settles after a storm. Quiet, yes, but humming with unresolved tension. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, letting the sound of the percolator fill the space where my stepfather's voice used to echo with unsolicited advice and backhanded compliments. The house, now free of his presence, seemed to exhale in relief, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of his condescension. I wrapped my fingers around the warm mug and moved to the front window, pulling back the curtain just enough to watch him sitting in his car, still parked across the street. He had been there since dawn, too proud to knock, too embarrassed to leave, and most likely too furious to think straight. From my vantage point, I could see him checking his phone, pacing around the car, and occasionally glancing up at the house with a mixture of disbelief and rage. It wasn't just about the house anymore, not really. It was about control. Alan had built his entire identity around the illusion of authority, and I had shattered it with nothing more than evidence, timing, and patience. And maybe a little poetic justice, too. I let him stew out there for another hour before I stepped onto the porch, my robe tied neatly around my waist and my phone in hand, already recording. His head snapped up like a coiled snake hearing movement in the grass. "You think this is funny?" he spat, walking toward me with his usual performative swagger, though it now hung crooked on his shoulders like a jacket that didn't quite fit. "You think locking me out, humiliating me like that, is something to be proud of?" I didn't flinch. "I think protecting my home, my legal rights, and my mother's legacy is something she would be proud of," I said, keeping my voice even, measured. "What I'm not proud of is how long I tolerated your presence under this roof." He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if doing so might add weight to his words. "You're going to regret this, Lily. You made a lot of noise with that injunction, but noise fades. And eventually, you'll realize you need help. You can't handle this house on your own." It would have been almost comical if it weren't so exhausting, the way he underestimated me even now, after everything I'd done to reclaim what was rightfully mine. "Help from you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. The man who tried to forge a legal document, defraud a buyer, and sell a property he didn't own? That's not help, Alan. That's a con. And you got caught. His face contorted, the mask slipping for a brief second, revealing the bitter desperation that lay beneath his carefully curated arrogance. That house wouldn't even be standing if it weren't for me. I paid bills. I managed contractors. I kept it afloat after your mother got sick. You paid bills with her money? I replied, my voice cold now. You hired contractors to install things we didn't need so you could skim off the top. And when she got sick, you were more interested in her life insurance policy than her comfort. He blinked, and I saw the moment hit him. He knew I'd been watching longer than he realized. You're delusional, he muttered, turning away. This isn't over. No, it isn't, I agreed. Which is why I suggest you find legal representation before the buyer's lawsuit and the criminal charges hit your doorstep. Because while you were busy gallivanting through Europe and posting first-class selfies with expensive wine, I was working with a forensic accountant. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he walked back to his car, slamming the door so hard the neighbor's dog started barking. I waited until he drove off before I walked back inside, locking the door behind me, not out of fear, but out of principle. I had drawn the boundary, and I intended to keep it firmly in place. Later that day, Meg called with an update. The buyers filed their own fraud complaint this morning, she said, her tone brisk and pleased. Their legal team has officially named Alan as the sole responsible party in the failed sale. They're demanding damages and restitution for the lost investment, plus court fees. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the words sink in. And the police? They've been reviewing the forged documents. They're taking it seriously. You may need to provide a statement soon. I'm ready, I said simply, because I was. I had been ready from the moment I saw that sold sign on my lawn and realized what kind of man Alan truly was. All the years of biting my tongue, of smiling through his snide remarks and pretending his cruelty was just bad humor, those days were over. By the time evening rolled around, I found myself back in the library, my mother's old music room that I had lovingly transformed into a quiet reading space filled with sunlight and leather-bound books. I ran my fingers along the spines, pausing every so often to pull one out, read an inscription, or find an old note she had left in the margins. Her presence still lived here, in this house, in these walls, in the life she built and handed over to me, not Alan. That night, I opened the bottle of wine I'd been saving for something significant, and I poured a glass in her honor. I raised it toward the fireplace, where her portrait still hung above the mantel, smiling in that serene way she always had when she knew something others didn't. To you, Mom, I whispered. He thought he could erase you. But you're still here. And so am I. The house creaked slightly, as if agreeing with me, and I sat in silence, letting the truth settle like dust after an earthquake. The worst was behind me, but I knew the road ahead would still require resilience. Alan wouldn't go quietly. Men like him never did. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the noise. I was ready to make some of my own. The days that followed were a surreal blend of legal meetings, late-night document reviews, and the quiet reclaiming of space that had once felt compromised by someone else's entitlement. There was something deeply liberating about walking through each room of my house and feeling, truly and without hesitation, that it was mine again. Not just because the courts were finally aligning with the truth, or because Alan had been served with a restraining order after a particularly loud and frankly pathetic confrontation in front of my mailbox, but because I had finally stopped internalizing his version of me, the small, foolish, overly emotional woman he had painted to anyone who would listen. I knew who I was now. I wasn't the timid caretaker he'd mistaken for a pushover. I was my mother's daughter, and I had her quiet fire in my veins. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old paperwork in the attic, a task I had been dreading but could no longer put off, I stumbled upon a dusty, leather-bound folder tucked between a box of Christmas ornaments and a stack of childhood photo albums. The folder bore my mother's initials, embossed in gold, and the moment I opened it, the air seemed to shift around me. Inside were documents I hadn't known existed, letters, notes, and a journal she had kept during her final year, handwritten in her graceful cursive, each page dated and full of observations, reflections, and quiet warnings. There were entries about her illness, yes, but also about Alan. Observations I had missed, things I hadn't wanted to see, his unexplained absences, the sudden withdrawal of joint funds, the way he had started speaking over her in conversations, especially when we discussed future plans. One entry stood out like a flare in the dark. If something happens to me, make sure Lily knows where everything is. Don't let him get to her. She's stronger than he believes. I sat on the floor of the attic for a long time after reading that, the weight of her trust settling on my shoulders like a cloak. She had known. Long before I did, she had seen through his polished surface and hollow promises. She had seen his hunger for control, for power, and she had tried to shield me from it the best way she could, with preparation. Among the papers was a sealed envelope addressed to me. Inside was a letter, dated just 2 weeks before she passed, in which she outlined additional assets she had quietly transferred into my name, fearing Alan would try to liquidate them the moment her health declined. A small investment property in Sedona, a savings bond account I had never even heard of, and a separate checking account tied to her maiden name, untouched and holding a modest but meaningful amount of emergency funds. I blinked back tears as I read her final paragraph. If Alan tries to convince you that you're incapable of standing on your own, remember this. He only believes that because he knows it isn't true. You were always the one paying attention. Fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, I met with Meg the next morning to go over everything. We combed through the journal, the letter, and the property records, compiling a comprehensive file that painted a picture not just of financial fraud, but of a deliberate, calculated effort to manipulate me into giving up control over what was rightfully mine. Meg was almost gleeful. "Judge's love motive," she said, flipping through the folder like a predator circling its prey. "This is motive in your mother's own handwriting." Alan, meanwhile, had taken to parading himself around town like a disgraced celebrity, stopping by local cafes, pretending the situation was nothing more than a family misunderstanding. He spun tales of a daughter drunk on resentment, trying to punish her poor, grieving stepfather for daring to move on. Most people were polite enough to nod while he talked, but the tide was turning fast. Our community wasn't big, and word of the lawsuit had spread. People knew what he'd done, and even those who once humored him had started looking away when he entered a room. I heard from one of the baristas at the local coffee shop that he'd been evicted from his Airbnb after failing to pay for an extended stay. Apparently, he'd tried to charm the owner into a discount for a local celebrity, and she had laughed in his face. He was staying with a former golf buddy now, someone he'd once bragged about vacationing with in the Amalfi Coast. But from what I gathered, the guest room didn't come with room service or respect. Meg advised me not to gloat, but I didn't need to. I was too focused on preparing for the civil hearing, where Alan would have to explain, under oath, why he had forged documents, attempted to sell a property he did not own, and misrepresented his role in my mother's estate. I wasn't after revenge. I was after clarity. I wanted a legal record that would confirm, without ambiguity, what had happened here, that I had been robbed not only of money, but of trust, security, and peace, and that I had fought back. A few days before the hearing, Alan left a voicemail I didn't bother to return. His voice was different, less confident, more brittle. He tried to spin a new narrative, one of reconciliation. "We both made mistakes," he said. "But maybe it's time to stop the legal nonsense and just come to the table. We can settle this privately. No need to drag your mother's memory through court." I stared at the phone in silence, letting the words settle like dust on unused furniture. Dragging my mother's memory? He had desecrated it the moment he chose greed over love, control over care. He had dragged her memory through the dirt and then tried to sell it to the highest bidder. No, there would be no private settlement. The court date was set for next week. My attorney had everything in place. The judge, from what Meg told me, was someone who took property fraud and estate manipulation very seriously. Alan was in for a reckoning. And as I prepared my statement, I realized this wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about legacy, truth, and the choice to stop letting manipulators rewrite the narrative. He had sold the house in his mind. But I had reclaimed the story. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and still, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the anticipation buzzing quietly beneath my skin. I had barely slept the night before, not out of anxiety or doubt, but from the sheer weight of everything that had led up to this moment. There had been so many steps, so many choices, so many days spent doubting whether I could hold the line long enough to see justice win. But here I was, zipping up a navy blue blazer in front of the mirror, tying back my hair, and looking myself in the eyes with something very close to pride. I looked like my mother in that moment. Not just in the cheekbones or the eyes, but in the expression she used to wear whenever she knew she was doing something difficult but necessary. The expression that said, "I will not be moved." The courthouse was a pale sandstone building perched in the center of town like some kind of quiet sentinel. Not flashy, not intimidating, just solid, dependable, built to witness the unfolding of consequences. Meg met me at the top of the stairs, her binder already clutched to her chest, her lipstick as sharp as her tone. "Alan's already inside," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "He brought a lawyer, some guy he probably found last minute who specializes in traffic tickets and petty disputes. Should be interesting." I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders settle. Let's give them a show. Inside, the courtroom was a modest space with polished wooden benches and a judge's bench that sat elevated, a quiet reminder of whose word would hold final weight today. Alan was seated near the front, hunched slightly forward in a way that was meant to suggest calm, but instead screamed discomfort. He wore one of his usual vacation blazers, tan with a faint window pane pattern, and the effect was more used car salesman than upstanding citizen. His lawyer, a thin man with glasses that slid repeatedly down his nose, whispered something urgently in his ear. Alan didn't look at me when I entered. He didn't even flinch. He just stared straight ahead like the act of acknowledgement would somehow legitimize everything he had spent the last year pretending wasn't happening. The judge was a middle-aged woman with a stern face and a voice like gravel over silk. She didn't waste time. "We are here today to determine whether the sale of the Harrison property was conducted lawfully and with the proper authority of all relevant parties," she said, her tone leaving no room for interpretation. "Let's proceed." Meg stood with the quiet force of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment since the very beginning. She began with the original deed, walking the court through my mother's will, the clean transfer of ownership to me, the notarized documents, and the full history of the property. Every sentence she spoke was like a scalpel, cutting away the lies Alan had wrapped himself in. She presented the forged amendment Alan had slipped into the estate papers, the one that claimed joint ownership, and then pulled out the original, untouchable with matching witness signatures and dates. He attempted to commit fraud by submitting this falsified version to the escrow agent, Meg said, holding the forged document aloft. And he did so in order to sell a property he knew did not legally belong to him. We have email records, bank transactions tied to the fake sale, and testimony from the buyers, who are now suing him separately for misrepresentation and attempted real estate fraud. Alan's lawyer stammered in response, trying to claim confusion over the documents, suggesting perhaps Alan had simply been mistaken in his understanding of the estate. The judge cut him off. "A mistake is a missing signature," she said sharply. This was an orchestrated effort to bypass legal ownership and sell a property he had no right to. Continue. Then Meg did something I hadn't known she planned. She introduced the journal. My mother's handwritten entries. The one where she warned me about Alan. The one where she detailed her fear that he might try to manipulate the estate. Meg didn't read it out loud, not out of mercy, but out of respect. Instead, she offered the original for judicial review and submitted the transcript to the court record. "This is not simply a matter of property," Meg said as she closed her argument. "This is a matter of intent. Mr. Alan Monroe attempted to steal a home from his late wife's daughter. A home left explicitly and legally to her. He did so by falsifying documents, lying to financial institutions, and misleading innocent third-party buyers. He took advantage of grief, trust, and the assumption that people like him would never stoop so low. And now, finally, he must face the consequences of those choices. The judge called a recess to review the full documentation before issuing a ruling. As the courtroom emptied out, I walked past Alan without looking in his direction, but I could feel his gaze on me, hot with resentment and disbelief. For a man who had spent his life bluffing, this was the moment he finally realized the cards he'd been holding were blank. An hour later, we reconvened. The judge didn't waste time. "Mr. Monroe," she began, her voice calm but ice-cold, "you have been found to have willfully attempted to commit real estate fraud. The forged documentation you submitted, combined with evidence from the opposing party, demonstrates a clear and deliberate attempt to circumvent estate law. The court rules that the property in question belongs solely to Ms. Lily Harrison. All rights, titles, and claims associated with the attempted sale are nullified, and escrow funds, if unrecovered, are to be returned to the buyers at your expense. Furthermore, your actions have been referred to the district attorney for review under criminal fraud statutes." I didn't exhale until I heard the gavel hit the bench. Alan's face went slack. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have a single word to say. No smirk. No clever retort. Just stunned, silent failure. Meg turned to me with a subtle nod. "It's over." But we both knew it wasn't truly over, not yet. There were still legal fees to collect, still a pending civil suit from the buyers, still damage to repair, emotionally and otherwise. But my home was mine again. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt safe where I stood. It's strange, the way peace arrives, not with a grand announcement or sudden fireworks, but like a slow tide rising quietly around your ankles, washing away the debris you've grown too used to stepping over. In the weeks after the hearing, I found myself lingering longer in the garden, listening to the wind shift through the trees my mother had planted, feeling the weight of something I hadn't experienced in years, stillness without fear. The house was mine again, not just on paper, not just legally, but in every lived-in, quiet, sacred way that mattered. I no longer checked the mail expecting a forged document. I no longer flinched at unknown numbers flashing across my phone screen. I no longer feared what Alan might do next, because the story had shifted out of his hands and back into mine. Alan, as it turned out, had found the fall from self-appointed grace deeper than he'd anticipated. With civil litigation mounting from the defrauded buyers and a criminal investigation officially underway, his funds, never as vast as he'd once claimed, began drying up like a riverbed under the summer sun. His designer loafers, his first-class flights, his slick charm and imported watch collection, none of it could save him now. And perhaps the cruelest twist, at least for him, was that people had stopped listening. Whatever remnants of social currency he'd once wielded, the old friends who humored his arrogance, the golf buddies who laughed at his half-truths, had gone quiet. Nobody wanted to be connected to a man who had tried to swindle his own stepdaughter out of her inheritance and wound up in the local news, not for a charity gala or a property investment, but for forgery and fraud. He sent one final message, a poorly typed email from what looked like a burner account, filled with accusations, half-baked threats, and the desperate suggestion that we had both played our part in the mess. I forwarded it to Meg, who added it to the growing file she was assembling for the DA's office. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to a man who had long ago decided that power was more important than decency, and who only viewed people in terms of how useful they were to him. What surprised me most in the aftermath, however, wasn't Alan's collapse. It was how many people quietly reappeared to offer their support, neighbors, old family friends. Even the barista at the cafe who had once looked at me with mild pity now handed me my coffee with a warm smile and an extra espresso shot on the house. I wasn't just the woman whose stepfather tried to sell her home. I had somehow become something more than that. I had become the woman who stood her ground. I spent a lot of time in the weeks that followed going through my mother's things. It was something I'd always put off, both out of grief and out of guilt, as if sorting through her belongings might be mistaken for moving on. But now, with the house quiet and the pressure gone, I found myself wanting to touch every piece of her life, not to let go, but to remember. There were the silk scarves she used to tie around her hair on windy days, still scented faintly with her favorite lavender oil. There were the recipes she'd handwritten in the back of old novels, as if she couldn't quite separate stories from sustenance. And then there was the music box, hidden in the back of her nightstand, unopened for years, still playing the same soft tune that used to lull me to sleep when I was 5 years old and frightened by thunderstorms. One evening, as the sky turned the color of burnished copper and the house was filled with nothing but the sound of cicadas and the occasional creak of the floorboards, I sat down at the kitchen table with a thick envelope. Inside were documents Meg had prepared for the final round of filings, things to formally update the deed, remove Alan's name from old utility accounts, and close the loop on the legal threads that had once threatened to unravel everything. Among the papers was one I hadn't expected, a small, simple certificate of ownership for the Sedona property my mother had left me in secret. I had almost forgotten it in the whirlwind of legal battles, but here it was now, a quiet promise of something new. I smiled, thinking of all the times my mother had said, "Sedona is where I go to breathe." Maybe it was time I learned how to breathe there, too. In the months that followed, I began restoring the house, not because it needed fixing, but because I wanted to make it wholly mine. I refinished the porch swing, repainted the library, and replaced the old garden gate with one I crafted by hand, wood panel by wood panel. Every nail, every brushstroke, every carefully chosen plant in the backyard became a testament, not just to survival, but to reclaiming something that was never his to touch. I held a small gathering in the garden in early spring, just close friends and neighbors, no grand speeches or dramatic retellings, just laughter, shared wine, and the kind of easy conversation that comes when people know they're welcome. I looked around at the people seated beneath the string lights I'd hung the night before and felt, for the first time in a long time, at home not only in place, but in purpose. Before everyone left, I walked them through the house. Not to show off, but to share. This was no longer a space shadowed by manipulation or betrayal. It was light-filled again. It was safe. It was mine. Later that night, as I sat alone on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and a glass of wine in hand, I allowed myself to whisper the words I'd held in for too long. "We made it, Mom." A breeze moved through the trees then, soft and sure. The house stood behind me, steady and strong. And in that quiet, golden hour of life reclaimed, I finally understood. This was never the story of a man who took something from me.